Good afternoon, and welcome to this month's Lunch with the Libraries and Museums, the ongoing speaker series that spotlights the unique collections, pioneering initiatives, and outstanding staff of the Sheridan Libraries and University Museums. My name is Clare Miller, President of the Friends Advisory Council. The Friends of the Libraries are one of the oldest university library support groups in the United States. Since 1931, we have provided financial support, advocacy, and volunteer assistance to ensure that the libraries remain one of the university's strongest assets, the heart of the intellectual life at Hopkins. Today's lecture will showcase some of the most interesting, beautiful, and rare items in our medieval and Renaissance manuscript collection. Leading the conversation is Dr. Earle Havens, the director of the Virginia Fox Stern Center for the History of the Book in the Renaissance. Joining him is JJ Lopez Haddad, a PhD candidate in the Department of History at JHU. Detailed bios of both can be found in the description below. We thank you for joining us and hope that you enjoy the impressive craftsmanship and detailed illuminations that make these books and manuscripts so unique.
Hello, my name is Earle Havens. I am the director of the Virginia Fox Stern Center for the History of the Book in the Renaissance here in the Sheridan Libraries at Johns Hopkins University. And it is my distinct pleasure to be joining you today in one of the great spaces at Johns Hopkins University, the John Work Garrett Library at the Evergreen Museum and Library here in Baltimore. And it is also my distinct pleasure to introduce JJ Lopez Haddad, who is currently a curatorial fellow at the Stern Center, which is located here at Evergreen. And we're very excited because we have a summer ahead of us in which we are going to fully catalog, not just generally catalog, but like closely catalog all of our medieval and Renaissance manuscripts, so pre-1600 as a date range. And then we're going to have all of it digitized and then hosted on a website called the Digital Scriptorium, which you can actually just go visit online. Just Google Digital Scriptorium in order to understand more about that project. JJ is a PhD student in the history department and is interested in the High Middle Ages and interactions between different religions within the period of the Crusades.
Yes, especially in the Mediterranean and all of those regions where everyone's trading and everyone's fighting each other, and encountering each other.
And encountering each other.
Yeah.
And getting the perspectives of each of those different communities.
Exactly.
But one of the wonderful things about being a medievalist is that you're automatically a rare book person.
Exactly.
Because all you've got, pretty much, are medieval manuscripts from which to work. And JJ is a great fan of illuminated manuscripts of the period that he's studying. And so we're going to look at some of the really interesting things in our collection. But before we do that, I just want to give you a general understanding that Hopkins has never really seriously attempted to collect medieval and Renaissance manuscripts. And that would have been a bad idea, you know, had not the Walters Art Museum been established, which actually is the home of the second largest collection of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah. Like
by a country mile, second only to the Morgan Library in New York. And so with that understanding that the Walters was fulfilling that mission, what we've built is largely a teaching collection of exemplars, but nonetheless have great intellectual importance. And I think perhaps our most important early medieval or high medieval manuscript is this 12th century copy of Peter Lombard's Sentences, which, JJ, what about this book is interesting?
Well, a lot of things about this book are interesting. Now that you say teaching collection, well, this was also meant to be a teaching book. Yeah. This is the Middle Ages' primary textbook for teaching theology, which was compiled by Peter Lombard in the 12th century, around that time in the High Middle Ages. And he took bits and pieces, the most important ones from the Church Fathers, from the Bible, from all of these great writers that you previously would have had to access separately, and he put them together for each student to have one.
So he kind of rationalized Christian theology, and in so doing also helped to support the concept of a dogma that the church could support. And rather than have people in France believing certain things and people in Spain believing others.
Exactly. He created a canon of important bits and pieces of theology that I'm sure he wasn't sure that it would spread and become one of the most popular texts in the Middle Ages, but it did. Yeah. This is where a lot of theologians find common ground. And this is a prime example of the quintessential sort of medieval manuscript that people have in their heads. Maybe not the most decorated ones, but it shows how they were made. Now, each of these leaves, they're not paper, they're all parchment. And what parchment is basically the treated, dried, and stretched out and cut skin of an animal. The finest parchment is called vellum and was made from calf skin, really young calves. But it could be made from any animal skin. Most often it was cows or whatever livestock the country of production had. People would eat the rest, but they wouldn't waste the animal. They would also turn the skin into parchment. So they would treat it with lye, and they would scrape down all of the hair, and the lye would sort of whiten it and set it and stop putrefaction, the decomposition of the skin. And then on a big stretcher with strings, they would stretch it out and they would grind it with a big half-moon shaped knife until it was around paper thin or cardstock thin. They vary in thicknesses. And then it was cut down and made into books. Now that was very expensive. A book like this would have probably needed at least 50 large animals, 50
So a herd, an entire herd of animals.
An entire herd.
To create one book.
Yeah. And since it was very expensive, and this was a teaching book, it wasn't that important for the parchment to be of the best quality. It's a bit thick, which it's great for us because it means that it survives and it doesn't degrade.
And we'll see when we get to more illuminated versions of manuscripts where the decorative quality is important, where it's a much finer, and often the skin of a younger animal, which is actually a great sacrifice because you're killing a young animal before it can give you milk.
Yeah,
for
often
example.
Unborn animals are the
well,
most...
there's the theory,
There's the theory.
The intrauterine flesh of unborn animals, but there's quite a bit of debate about whether that actually happened.
Exactly. It would have been very, very wasteful.
Yeah.
But for example, so you've got here what basically is the title page, and it's not a very luxurious book, but you still need to know where things begin. So you have these decorated initial here. But now someone who was also practicing their paragraph marks here down in the edge left us handling the name of the author there, Peter Lombard, and it says Peter Lombard, Petrus Lombardus Prologus Incipit. So here begins the prologue of Peter Lombard. And it continues on, and here we can see more how the whole manuscript is constructed. After getting the sheets from the animal, it was written out before binding it, but before you could write it down, you had to rule and line it so all of the text would fit in neat little columns, and that not only served to organize the text, but also to leave space on the margins, and sometimes between the lines for annotations.
So what are these little holes?
So the holes, they start the ruling process by pricking the parchment. So whenever you're ruling these days, something you might do a little pencil mark, but they pricked the holes. The advantage was that you could pre-prick various sheets at the same time, and that made the whole process of ruling easier. And you could rule with a variety of things. Sometimes people just incise grooves into the parchment. Here, it looks like we have some sort of metal point, perhaps silver point.
I think they use bone too.
Bone too, yeah, bone to sort of incise.
So not drawing the line, but just incising into the skin.
And silver point is kind of drawing, but it's depositing a little bit of silver in the page. But there are a lot of techniques, and And you might notice that the page has a few holes in it, like a small hole here. And we can turn to a more exciting example over here.
So we should stop and say this is probably an Italian manuscript.
Yeah.
And we can tell that because we've been trained in the art of paleography, or the study of old handwriting. Handwriting had the advantage of changing about every quarter century to half a century, relatively, and certain regions of Europe have specific attributes of that transformation of writing. And this is in a very high Gothic fraktur, what we call black letter kind of Gothic script that you literally cannot read until you're trained to read it.
And it's highly abbreviated
And
too.
it's highly with ligatures. They created so they never wanted to finish a word if they didn't have to, because it saves space on the page, so you save money. But these imperfections of the flesh are really prominent here, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And it doesn't mean that the manuscript was, or that the parchment was damaged during the process of making it. These most often are imperfections on the animal skin that when the skin gets stretched get magnified. So maybe a small wound, even an insect prick can over time magnify into these holes. And they were very pragmatic about this. They were not going to waste a whole sheet of parchment. So with tears like this, they would often sew them together so they wouldn't break any
Like
further.
literally with a needle and thread.
With a needle and thread. The thread, since they use linen, it didn't survive now, but we still have the places where it would be. So that would keep it from breaking further, especially as you handle the book. And they just write around it. They just write around the hole.
So it's really funny looking because it's, they're literally negotiating with the flesh as they write.
And we have other examples, such as here, where they cannot sew this one together because it's a hole. But, they just get on with it and they write around the hole, and that's what you're supposed to do. And oftentimes, very funny-minded scribes would create these holes into beasts and decorate them. But I guess this one just wanted to get the job done.
Yeah, this is a scholar's book. They're not going to spend a lot of time decorating it.
This is the textbook that you want.
This is one of only two illustrations. And it's very interesting because it's a beast.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So you usually only have these sort of big illustrations when you're marking the beginning of a important division of the text, and it doesn't hurt to have them decorated. And in the mind of the people that were reading this, these were often themes of meditation, and the beasts represented earthliness, they represented the devil, they represented things that you were supposed to fight against, or things you must wrestle with. Yeah. And what you must wrestle with in this book is just the abundance of theological knowledge here. That is expanded. And you can see also that there are smaller initials, and these are basically paragraph markings. Since they want the text to be as compressed as they can, the only way to signal where new sections begin is with new initials. Now, they look very pretty, but they also have that practical purpose.
Yeah, and you'll see the alternating use of blue and red, which is very common. It adds yet another layer of that kind of quick visual, this is a new section. This is a new section.
Yeah, and the text in red is now what is more descriptive text, or what you might call meta text. It's telling you what is treated in the paragraph. So title markings. Sometimes in other books that we're going to see, it instructs you to do something. It's actions or description.
We call this rubrication. Literally the use of the color red. Now this looks very different from this object.
Yes. So we move away. Oh, and this is interesting. We have a little unfinished initial over here.
Yeah, it's obviously they were not concerned about illustrating this manuscript nearly as much as a personal devotional book would have been.
But now, shifting between learning, now we come to praying, which would have been done in the same space if you're in a university, especially studying theology. And this is another characteristic manuscript of the beginning of the High Middle Ages. It's a liturgical manuscript. It's a fragment of a missal. Now here, we are in Germany now, and we can know that we are in Germany with this manuscript, that it was made in Germany, because it contains music, and the music was composed and notated in Hufnagel neumes, or also called Nagelschrift neumes, which just means resembling the nail of a horseshoe. Which, you know, if you've seen those things, and I have, they're remarkably similar. They're these little tiny nails, and they mark them apart from all of the neumes in Europe. So that was the form of musical notation that they had then, and it comes from gestural markings that happened in the Middle Ages, that were done in the early Middle Ages, that sort of told you how a melody went. But here they've been developed into an actual musical scale. You have here a staff that indicates you where the notes are, and you even have little clefs at the beginning. So we have a C clef here. So a trained musician would be able to agree with another trained musician on what it sounded like. However, they had to establish the pitch first. It only tells you the intervals. It doesn't tell you which notes are exactly which.
So in a way, it was when you have the earliest neumes, what we call adiostatic
neumes. Yeah.
They're almost like mnemonic gestures for a
Yes.
priest who actually already knows the song
Yeah.
or the melody, but they just don't know exactly where to start and where to stop necessarily as they're conducting a sacrament.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And this now becomes more for storing knowledge rather than just reminding you of the knowledge that you have, and this will evolve to become the Western musical notation that we still use. Now, I mentioned that this is a leaf from a missal. So like Lombard, at the period of the High Middle Ages in the 12th and the 13th century, people were compiling all of the texts that you needed for the celebration of the Mass, the Eucharist, the most important ritual of the medieval Catholic Church.
Funerals
Too.
Weddings,
into a single book.
into a single book.
So before, all of these texts, all of these fragments would have been in different books that you would have had to consult, and people would have to bring them down during each Mass. But here, a priest could celebrate the Mass from a single book, and he could do it alone. He didn't need assistance. And what this meant was more Masses per day, per week. A priest was usually allowed to do one Mass per day. And if you get endowed by a noble person and the person asks you to pray for their soul, it means more prayers said for the soul of someone, more souls out of purgatory, more souls out of salvation. So it was a very practical text for the priest, but also practical spiritually. It allowed you to get more bang for your spiritual buck.
Yeah,
basically.
there's an economy to the medieval manuscript, that everything is a commodity. But actually, by developing these efficient forms of texts, where you didn't need assistance to conduct the Mass because you weren't reading from multiple books, you could just become more efficient. So much of the, we describe ligatures as saving space, which saves money. But these manuscripts represent this larger human impulse for efficiency and for the production of commodity that really fulfills certain goals. Now, this is a fragment that was actually taken out of a book binding.
Yes.
We call this binding waste. And nowadays, to acquire a missal of this such as this as a complete book is an extremely expensive proposition.
Yeah.
There are only a couple of rare booksellers in the world, really, who specialize in actually selling medieval books to the present day. And in fact, two of them are the source of several of the things, certainly this object on the table. So, JJ, now we have a real missal, not a fragment.
Yes, now we have a real missal, a French missal from the sort of like early 15th century, probably, or late 14th century, maybe in that estimation. It's from France, and it's a little bit of a special interest to me because it shows signs of continuous use. But let's just see. Here we are at the page of the Litany of the Saints, and as you can see, this one's richly illuminated. Every initial is done with gold leaf on it, so they would prepare clay ground on the parchment and then gild it and paint it again with the sort of red and blue theme that is really good and contrasting.
And very often the scribe who wrote the text would not be the same person who does the illumination. It was a division of labor.
No, and especially in Paris, we get to a place where there is a quasi-industrial production of books. You had parchmenters, you had scribes, you had illuminators, illustrators, and they all traded their works with each other.
And we'll also see that the page, the animal skin is much thinner.
It is much thinner, finer, much whiter, which makes it a little bit more fragile, but it's very pleasing. And now you can see this opening with glorious marginalia. This was probably pre-done by a specialist that focused on margins and then scripted over. And then the only picture that we have is this tiny historiated initial that is an initial with a picture in it of the resurrected Christ. And this is the liturgy for Easter, for
the
Easter
highest
Day.
holy day in the Christian tradition.
The highest holy day, and it makes sense that it's the most decorated page. Now, these pages all shift according to the year, but there are certain ones that stay constant. For example, here we begin sort of like the canon of the Mass, which is the moment in which the bread and wine are consecrated into the body and blood of Christ according to Christian theology. And this begins also with music. We have the same neumes. They're not Hufnagel neumes. They're more standard European neumes, but they use the same scale. It's the same. And some of this music we still sing today. If you've gone to church, it's survived for this long time. And this...
Allow me to hold it up. And why don't you sing for us from the medieval book?
Yes, and this is what's called the sursum corda. So, per omnia saecula saeculorum. Amen. Dominus vobiscum, et cum spiritum tuum, sursum corda, and so on and so forth. It's basically saying, prepare to celebrate the sacrament. Let's lift up our hearts to the Lord. And then, at the actual moment of consecrating the bread and wine, you have the Sanctus, you have the other prayers of the canon, but usually these missals have a crucifixion scene that the priest can kiss or
kiss
venerate.
the feet of the crucified Christ in the picture.
Exactly. But
what's that called?
Osculation, you know. Or you could have an osculation target so you don't ruin the picture with the kisses, which happens often. You can see various examples online. But this one appears to not have one, or had one that was removed, but someone in around 1570s, when the new missal was being published, the Tridentine Missal, and
a printed missal.
A printed missal was being published in the Counter-Reformation. Someone replaced it with a printed crucifixion scene. Now, we don't have it anymore, but we have the imprint and the ink migration.
It's a shadow of an inked plate that was placed in here, which must have been very strange looking, right?
Yes.
Like, they could still have painted a miniature if they wanted to, but
I guess they were pressed for time.
Utilitarian.
Exactly.
So JJ actually identified the original woodcut, and so now we know. So now we're on the hunt for a copy of that book for our collection.
Yeah, and this could have been quite subversive, because you were not meant to be using these books once the new missal was printed, and so this was probably by some what are called Gallican Catholics trying to preserve the old liturgy, preserve the heritage when Rome was trying to standardize what they did.
Right. So this is actually, you were not supposed to use a medieval book after the Council of Trent in the 16th century. But obviously somebody didn't like what Trent had to say. And the French church is probably the most infamous for not following. They even had exemptions for periods of time.
They had exemptions, they had the French Wars of Religion, they had a lot of stuff about that.
And just as this would have been owned by a very wealthy canon of a cathedral or a bishop.
Yeah.
Because it just would have cost an absolute fortune. It would have been the most valuable object that you probably owned. Now that, by contrast with this is not a priest, that's a book for a priest, and this is a book for a layperson. And as you can see, it's brilliantly illuminated. Now, weirdly, if you look, all of the full-page miniatures are extant. Very often they're cut out and used as art, displayed as single works of art.
Because they're so beautiful.
And you can see this beautiful, heavy gold leaf surrounding the initial letters. with little putti and elements of what is becoming a kind of Renaissance style. So this is very late medieval Renaissance. And it's in Dutch. So also the transition from these Latin books to the vernacular languages, particularly for lay users. And the idea was, this is a book of hours. And what's an easy way to explain a book of hours, JJ?
So priests and monks had to pray 7 times every day in Latin.
In canonical hours of the day.
In canonical hours of the day. Those are the hours.
So matins, lauds,
exactly.
terce, prime, yeah.
And, you know, compline and all of that. And with the rise in piety, particularly in the 12th and 13th centuries, lay people, particularly wealthy lay people who could afford it, wanted to do that too. So they have a simplified version of that. The priests ones have prayers that change every season. Now this is something that you just recite 7 times every day, minimal text changes depending on Easter, and they're most often based on the life of the Virgin Mary. So they're called the little hours of the Virgin Mary. So you begin in the morning praying psalms. The books of hours are always structured about saying the Psalter, and around the Psalter you say other special prayers, always with the life of the Virgin Mary in mind. And that was the model really for particularly the noble woman, the pious noble woman to imitate, the Virgin Mary or Saint Anne, her mother. And so you often find a lot of illustrations from her life. You can also have the Holy Spirit, the Passion of Christ, and there's also the Hours of the Dead.
Right, the Book of the Dead.
Which is important when a family member has died and you want to pray for their soul.
Yeah. And there are other elements as well, but you know, contemplation of the 15 mysteries of the Virgin and that sort of thing. And they have these beautiful pictures to excite you. You'll have memorized this book if you're a pious enough person to be doing this every day. And that injunction has always been kind of like euphemistic.
Yes.
But and it's, you know, this would have cost a lot of money to produce.
Yeah.
Really would only have been owned by an extremely wealthy individual.
Many people like Jean, the Duke of Berry, the brother of the King of France, collected these books and showed them off as prestige items. I mean, they have very little signs of use. So.
And he actually commissioned the most famous of all the books of hours, the very rich hours of the Duc de Berry.
Yeah, with the Limburg brothers.
And then here we're going back to scholarly books. This is this was a completely conserved. The volume was falling apart, and so this is all modern, what we call furniture. These are clasps or modern, but actually when they did the conservation, they created this beautiful box with all of these elements. So here's the one surviving original medieval clasp. Here are tawed alum ties that were used in the binding structure. The remnants of headbands for the book. And then in another nifty part of this little book coffin, they retain the original boards. So you can actually, we don't want to throw anything away. We want, all of this is evidence of what this book was at any one time and at many different times in its history. But it's particularly interesting as a physical, I should say what it is. It's a very poorly illustrated medieval manuscript. It's just gestural towards decoration. It's mostly just text. But physically it's very interesting because it actually has little bookmarks. Prefabricated Turk's head, we sometimes refer to as. So think of a turban, and they're each different colors that they've been painted. And it's actually textile, I believe, over vellum. Or it could be colored vellum.
It would. I think these are.
I can't see.
I think these are actually braided silk.
Okay,
braided. They look like braided silk.
Because if you look at the tabs, the tops are braided silk.
Yeah.
But then they're on top of a piece of vellum.
Of vellum.
Strip.
Yeah.
And this is by a man called Ubertino di Casale, who was a fairly radical Franciscan, who insisted that Christ did not even own his own clothes, or something to that effect, and that the church should forswear wealth. Obviously, he was very unpopular with many in the church and imprisoned by the Pope for his radical preaching. And it was during a period of his incarceration that he apparently miraculously wrote this treatise on the tree of life. He figures prominently in Umberto Eco's medieval monastery murder mystery, The Name of the Rose. And it's a very rare manuscript.
And curiously enough, it's also paired with a prayer book, so you can read
Yeah.
and pray and
Yeah.
follow his teachings.
Yeah, and then this is the last of these medieval books that we'll look at, but this is a very special manuscript. It's also very personal.
It is very personal. So this is part of our Women of the Book collection, which Earle has helped the library amass over the years, which are books made by and related to women of the early modern and late Middle Ages, often religious women. And what this is a processional. So remember when I said back then that you would need different books for the liturgy before the missal? Well, this is kind of one of those. These are processions which happen before masses or before offices, where all of the nuns in a convent would assemble in order of seniority, carry a figure, and sing music as they go into church. And this one was made by a guy, actually a monk, a Cistercian monk called William. And we know this because it says so
It's in rubric.
in the rubrics at the end of
right
the
here.
book. So he made it for a nun that he knew.
His sister.
His sister, exactly.
So think about that, a medieval monk, a Cistercian, in around Switzerland in about 1460, and he commissions this manuscript to give to his Cistercian sister, who's in a convent about 15 miles away.
Exactly.
And it's her personal prayer book.
And this is extremely rare because usually books with music, especially books that covered a lot of music, were communal. They were gigantic, and they were meant to be read by a lot of monks and nuns at the same time. No one had their little personal books because they were so expensive. But I guess this was a very welcome gift to them, because she didn't need to depend on anyone else to sing her own music.
And the irony there is that nuns take a vow of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
But if you ever look at illustrations of nuns from the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, they're always distinguishable by the fact that they're holding a book.
Mm-hmm.
That's almost tells you who they are and what they are. And so the one concession one could imagine having in a simplistic Cistercian convent would be a book.
Exactly.
And this book is extremely important because it's the only book I've ever seen with its own custom-made bookmark.
Yeah.
And it actually has 4 elements all sewn together in this sort of Turk's head element, so you can mark 4 different sections of the processional so that you don't have to keep hunting around for the right section as you conduct the liturgy. So that's really extraordinary. And what's really crazy is I taught a class on the Women of the Book, and I had a graduate student in our History of Art department who I started passing around, and she says, "Oh my God, you bought that book?" Because she wrote her dissertation on the library in which this book was housed for a number of centuries. And she saw it online as an auction record, but she assumed that it had been bought by a private collector. And so she ended up including it in her dissertation. So that was like meant to be.
Yes.
That was
wonderful.
divine intervention, as it were.
Yes.
So now we're moving from the sort of the late Middle Ages into the Renaissance period, and we just have a few things out that are kind of interesting. I spoke about this earlier when JJ, you actually presented on the Hofnachlin manuscript, the missal fragment. A lot of manuscripts that we're able to acquire are single sheets or a couple of sheets, almost always replevened from a binding. Because in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, nobody ever wasted anything.
Yeah.
If here is a manuscript fragment of canon law, which became fairly obsolete in the Protestant world, the laws governing priests in the Catholic Church. And so they simply took this vellum and they attached them to wooden boards to protect and refine a binding.
Mm-hmm. And you can even see that the ink has transferred to the wood.
Yeah, it's actually a shadow there, like JJ's shadow of the crucified Christ in the Missal. And you'll see actually, it even is so nice that it's been taken off, because we can actually see what a medieval binding kind of looked like, or a Renaissance binding, as the case may be. But one of our great coups was to get these 2 sheets, which come from a very famous romance of the Middle Ages called the Roman de la Rose, the Romance of the Rose. What's a great way to describe that text?
It's sort of the first widely circulated book of popular literature.
Secular.
Of secular literature. Well, not popular because not everyone was reading this. You had to know how to read and have access to books first. But it's in French. It's in Old French. And what a roman is, it's a story in verse of courtly love themes. So these start becoming very popular in that time. So this is in French, it's written down, it's in verse. And these were popular cultural stories that people would share in European courts, and you would read for amusement, and you would quote from. So really the first sort of like vernacular literature that became really widespread in Europe, even if it was in French.
Yeah, and translated and imitated and all those things. And there are hundreds of copies of this manuscript text, of medieval copies, all over Europe and America. And actually, when digital humanities came onto the scene, Johns Hopkins was a leader in it by working to get as many copies digitized of the Roman de la Rose all over the world, and then to house them in what was called the Roman de la Rose Digital Library, or what is now called the Digital Library of Medieval Manuscripts, hosted on the Johns Hopkins Sheridan Libraries website. But the problem with this whole project was we had this professor who was very interested in this text, but we had no manuscripts of the Roman de la Rose at Hopkins.
Yeah.
So it was, when I saw these hidden away in an auction catalog in the summertime, I thought, boy, this is my one chance to fix that problem of not having any. And what's really interesting about these is that they're unfinished. Yeah. So it's like that unfinished initial in the Peter Lombard. It kind of gives you a clue to like how things were put together. And because you can search the Roman de la Rose Digital Library by themes, by subject matter, in this case Narcissus staring at himself in the pool, I was able to determine, based on these lollipop-like trees, that this is related to only one other known example of the Roman de la Rose with a similar pattern of trees, which is at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. So the power of digital technology to reach across oceans and to discover new things about very old manuscripts is a fabulous power that we now have. Here is really the father, as it were, of the Renaissance. This is Petrarch, the Italian humanist and poet. And this is actually a fragment, and you can see that it was literally, a binding of a book, and you can see it in the shape of it. But actually, this is a fragment of his most famous poem, the Triumphi, or the Triumphs. And this is actually a passage from the Triumph of Death. It's a very moralizing poem, but it was extremely popular. And what's super interesting is this is really close to the lifetime of Petrarch himself. And I love showing this to students of literature, because when we want to understand the best, closest copy to the original intention of the author, we have to look at the earliest contemporary manuscripts, because as books get copied over the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, errors start to accumulate in them. Right?
Exactly.
People miss out, they skip lines, they change words.
We have that problem in the Middle Ages too. They're very good at catching it, but as it speeds up, it becomes more of an issue.
Yeah. And actually, there are two words in this manuscript that are different than what we call the textus receptus, the received text, the authorized text, as it were, the one everyone's using to write literary criticism about Petrarch. So it's just a good visual tool to think about how important early manuscripts really are. Now, JJ started by showing you the most famous textbook, as it were, of Christianity of the Middle Ages, and now I'm able to show you the best textbook, the most common textbook, or one of them, for students of Latin in the Renaissance. This manuscript dates from about 1460. And it actually was owned by a Genoese noble family and a man called Antonio of Genoa. His arms appear here, and it's Agostino Datti's famous Elegantiole, this treatise on how to write elegant Latin. So in the Middle Ages, Latin was not necessarily quite as elaborate as it had been in the original, in the ancient world.
It was utilitarian. It was a common language that everyone spoke and wrote in, and it's often pretty simple grammatically.
Right, but by the Renaissance, we have the recrudescence of interest in the ancient Roman authors. And so imitating Cicero, learning how to represent yourself, how to write elegant letters, a kind of self-diplomacy. This text was literally written out just as printing was invented. And in fact, this manuscript predates the incunabulum, the first printed version of this text, by 10 years. So I would love to get one of those for the collection to put them next to each other. But for the time being, you'll see it too is a very simple utilitarian text, though not without some doodles by a not so attentive student of Latin. So it was wonderful to get something like this into the collection with this beautiful humanista hand in the Italian. You can literally read this without having to be trained in paleography. So in the ancient Roman world, you can read the text. In the Middle Ages, you got to go to school for a really long time to learn how to read that text. And then we get to the Renaissance, you can read the text again without any training. And they eliminate lots of ligatures to be ultra crystal clear about what they're saying. So this is like a perfect antidote or sort of bookend to the Peter Lombard of the Middle Ages. Some books are just complete surprises. This book is actually was written in 1492. It actually gives you the very day of its production, the Ides of May, 1493. So that'd be about May 15th, 1493. So 1 year after Columbus discovers the New World. And it's a disputation on the subject of miracles by a man called Petrus Haedus, who was a minor humanist. But the subject of miracles was always extremely controversial. The church was always worried about people writing about miracles because miracles are required for sanctification, for canonization of saints and so forth. But Petrus Haedus didn't really care all that much what the church thought, insofar as he engaged as an interlocutor in that discussion. And in fact, he was also an interlocutor in Lorenzo Valla's famous controversy about the donation of Constantine, which was also very critical of the Roman Catholic Church. But this is only one of two manuscripts of this text that survive. And this came up about 2008. And Professor Chris Chalenza and I worked together to acquire it. And then one of his graduate students decided to make this her dissertation. So a book that was acquired by the libraries literally became the dissertation of a PhD student. And a new book has just been written about it by a scholar in Italy who spoke at the Stern Center last year. So that's a great story of discovery and then of the implementation of new knowledge in scholarship by our own students.
And it's interesting, though, even it's a Renaissance book, the author sort of wants to go back to the Middle Ages where miracles were sort of everyone's realm and not just the realm of the church.
Yeah. It's a what we call a liminal book, right? At the threshold. Well, and finally, I just want to show this because it's beautiful. This is what we call a carta executoria, which is literally like a collection of depositions, legal depositions. It's always a manuscript. It's always on animal skin, because if it's not on animal skin, it's not legal. It has to be literally put on parchment, which is known to be much more likely to be preserved. And what it is the most important document in a family's history. And always in these cartas, they represent the pious family kneeling and praying. And then above, always a famous ancestor, whether real or imagined, who is extremely pious. In this case, a Dominican nun who actually has a halo. So literally a saint with little banderoles in which she's saying sacred words. And so this is like a Renaissance illumination. And it looks much more classicizing, much more pagan almost than some of the medieval. And this was produced with the arms of the family here, and an image of patron saint of Spain, Santiago de Matamoros, and then stamped by a notary, and then every page is stamped with this image, with this rubber stamp, literally, so that nobody can add anything to the page. So you can't invent new things. And all of this was produced to prove that you had purity of blood. So this comes from the racist and anti-Muslim ideology of Roman Catholic Spain at this time, in which they felt that anyone who had intermarried with Jews or with Muslims were less trustworthy. Now, why is this manuscript so important? Well, if you can prove that you have a certain degree of purity of blood, then you have access to join the aristocracy and have a complete exemption from taxes.
And Spain, medieval Spain and early modern Spain had the largest aristocracy of all of Europe.
And one of the most ancient,
And
continuous.
one of the most ancient,
some of those
yeah.
families go all the way back to the Visigothic period. So that is a legal document, but because of what it is, it's also a work of art.
And it's also beautifully protected by that
Silk.
silk coverings, and
Yeah.
you can see the faux marble and the very classicizing details, as you said.
Yeah. So that's medieval Renaissance manuscripts at Hopkins in a nutshell. I think it's possibly about 100 objects altogether, which we will digitize and make accessible to the world. But it's one thing to look at these fascinating, sometimes beautiful, sometimes rather grungy, but really interesting and important scholarly artifacts visually, but it's another to talk about them. So I know JJ and I are looking forward to hearing your thoughts and answering any questions that you may have.
So welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you all virtually here in the seminar room of the Stern Center for the History of the Book in the Renaissance at Johns Hopkins. And I'm here again with JJ, who helped us to explore the collections in, I think, a really robust and fun kind of a way. And you also got to see how we work hard to make this relatively esoteric material accessible to all kinds of people. I also, we already see we have questions. I think Cindy has given us two. One has to do with sheet music or musical notation. And it just so happens here in the seminar room that we have an example of that I can show you. And perhaps JJ can say a few words about it.
Yes, so
we have a number of these antiphonary leaves. We also have a very large medieval intact antiphonary with armored binding.
yes, that's a very exciting piece. So Cindy's question is, just to read it out, does Hopkins and Peabody Institute have a large collection of medieval and Renaissance sheet music? The answer is absolutely yes. This is one of the examples, as Earle was saying. This was actually from the collection of a very storied and famous professor, Professor Maxey, who donated it to us. This is a huge leaf from an antiphonary. And so these are additional pieces of music that you would have sung in the daily office when praying in a monastery. And it's large so that everyone can read from a single book, because it was very expensive and unfeasible to have everyone have their copy of the music. So they all read from a single lectern. And this is from Vespers. And you can tell it's from Vespers because it tells you after you've said the antiphon, which is sort of like a musical preface depending on the season. You say the Magnificat, the sort of like anthem of the Virgin Mary. And that is the signature anthem for the office of Vespers throughout the Middle Ages, early modern period, and even until today.
Yeah. There's a second question, I think also from Cindy, about literacy rates, which is a really interesting question. Unfortunately, we cannot raise the dead and ask them if they could read. The way that scholars have gotten at this question is through the study of archives, of long-standing archives over periods of time, and looking for signature literacy. So if somebody knew how to write their name down as a signature, it was assumed that that's probably the best piece of evidence that we have that this person may have been literate, partly because you learn to write after you learn to read, and not everyone learned to write because a lot of people didn't need to know how to write in order to do their crafts or their farming or whatever. and education was a commodity, and it was very much out of the reach of almost everybody. So just to give you a sense, like in the Renaissance, say like Shakespeare's England in London, in a city like London, it's thought that around 25 to 30% of men would have had some degree of literacy in the English language. And for women, it goes way down to under 10%.
Yeah.
But if you go to Norfolk in the countryside, or not Norfolk, let's say Buckinghamshire, all those numbers go way down.
Yeah. And there's a different, and the question of who is literate, how many people are literate is complicated, because in the Middle Ages, for example, just to go a bit back, to be considered properly literate is to read and write Latin. And that is just limited to the clerical class, and that's around 5% on a conservative estimate. And it's considered that because all government business and all official communications was in Latin. Even informal communications between learned people was in Latin. So if you were at a university and you wanted to write a letter to your parents, you would write it in Latin, and your parents, if they were rural, would go to the parish priest and ask, hey, we just got this letter from our son. What does it say? As Earle said, signature literacy is a very interesting way of discerning this. And actually, if you've been to the British Library recently, or if you go on their website, they're exhibiting the only known signature of Joan of Arc that we have in a charter. And that sort of reveals that Joan of Arc, even though she's a very famous, very renowned individual, she has her origins as a humble peasant girl, and she could only barely write her signature in a very crude script.
Yeah, and actually, like monarchs, even monarchs of the Middle Ages, some of them were not terribly educated, and they would leave a mark, like an X, or often a cross, like a crucifixion symbol, just to say that they. So we have nun profession documents from the Renaissance where the nun is matriculating into a convent and they have to sign the contract, and they just leave a cross because they just don't know how to do that. So Kath has asked about whether members of the public can see these objects in person. And the answer is yes. You just need to reach out to myself, and we can arrange for you to have a look at some of these things, likely at the main campus library, not here at Evergreen, where the Stern Center is located. And John has asked about speaking Latin, and thinking that very few people could do that. Actually, you weren't considered to be very well educated unless you knew some Latin. And the first thing you would learn after you learn your own vernacular language in the pre-modern and the early modern worlds is to learn Latin.
Yeah.
And literally Latin grammar, and then by reading the moral and ethical and philosophical texts of the ancient Romans and Greeks. Most people couldn't read Greek. They read it through Latin translation.
Yeah.
They would develop this facility. And the other one is, if you went to university, especially on the European continent, many people came from all over Europe to study medicine in Bologna, for example, or Padua. And like Copernicus from Poland went there. And of course, they would all have to speak Latin because they couldn't all speak all of their other languages. So Latin became what we call the lingua franca, the standard language of Europe. But JJ, you have some thoughts about this.
Yeah, and John, you're right. Only the clergy most of the time knows Latin, but what it meant to be part of the clergy back in the day is not what is like today. Today, we think of the clergy and we think of priests, maybe deacons. If you were a university student, or you were getting any formal education of any kind at a university or cathedral school, chances are you're ordained into one of the minor orders. So you're considered a minor cleric. You could be an acolyte or a porter or an exorcist. So these are sort of like pre-deacon, pre-subdeacon orders that people who were being trained, not necessarily to be a priest, but to function as someone within the church would have. So the clergy class was expanded. And a lot of noble people, not everyone, and not even if you were a king, you were guaranteed to do so, were literate. People who cared a lot about prayer, like King Louis IX of France, Saint Louis, were literate in Latin. but not everyone was guaranteed to be like that.
We have a question from Sif about what is our oldest book? Well, the oldest books are rocks. That is to say, we have Babylonian cuneiform tablets dating from the second millennium BCE. So literally not far from the time of King David in the collection. And one of them is baked and is surprisingly shaped almost exactly like the size of a cell phone. So I often will start a class by putting the cuneiform tablet up to my ear to just remind people that the history of communication has come a long way. But we have several of these tablets, and the Archaeology Museum at Hopkins has a significant collection of them. We also have a nice gathering of about 100 ancient Greek / Egyptian or Hellenistic papyri fragments. We just acquired recently a 10th century manuscript fragment of binding waste that has these audiostatic neumes that were discussed in our presentation. Meg has this thought about, wow, there must be social and economic issues relevant in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance to today. I don't know, JJ, does anything come to mind?
Yes, I mean, we're living in an era where, you know, we have to be very careful where we get our information from, and we have sort of like a crisis of truth and information. And that happens to me a lot when studying documents from the Middle Ages, because I have to be very cognizant of the fact that there are different levels of access to information. If you are an illiterate agrarian individual, you're not getting the latest developments in the study of, for example, the Quran. So you rely on, you know, apocryphal and very bigoted accounts of what Islam is actually like. And we see that in popular songs from the time. But if you're a learned cleric in the 12th and 13th century, you actually know that Muslims aren't actually pagan, like some popular songs say, and that they actually have a sophisticated system of theology that is Abrahamic. But there's always that divide because there's also this asymmetry of information, just because information is so expensive to maintain.
And controlled by the church. And like we have several cartulary forgeries in our collection where monks in monasteries decided to pretend that they owned a plot of land that they didn't. And the only people who had the records of such things were the monks. So there are hundreds, thousands of cartulary forgeries, and we have 2 in our Bibliotheca Fictiva collection. We have another question about the history of ownership. Provenance is very difficult often to trace in books, as indeed with paintings. But when we do have that evidence, we certainly preserve that. And when JJ and I complete cataloging a lot of these things for the digitization, we're going to include that information. We also asked if singing was a part of the Stern Center's activities. Well, before JJ arrived, the answer would probably be no.
Yeah.
And I would not even threaten to sing in front of you because I have a terrible voice. But it is wonderful to remember that these objects were performative, that they lived in the oral culture. You know, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the vast majority of information exchange was still oral. And indeed, as it still is in a sense today.
Mm-hmm.
But it's another thing to hear the Latin and the liturgy and the voices of the past. And these objects uniquely connect us to that soundscape and that reality.
Yeah.
And we've just run out of time, but I certainly want to thank JJ for his participation and for your time learning about these magnificent objects at Hopkins.
Yeah.
So thanks.
I'd like to thank you all and everyone who tuned in to listen to our conversation today. And for more information and to register for future virtual programming, visit hopkinsathome.jhu.edu. And thank you again, and hope you have a wonderful afternoon.